What if the man who helped build modern Japan also tried to destroy it? Saigo Takamori, warrior, philosopher, rebel, led the last true samurai into a doomed battle. He knew he would die, but he rode anyway. Why? This is the true story of the last samurai. Born in 1827 in Kagoshima, Saigo Takamori wasn't royalty. He came from a poor samurai family. Yet even as a child, he stood out, taller, stronger, quieter. He trained in Zen, mastered the sword, and believed in duty above all, even if it meant death. For over 200 years, Japan had closed its doors to the world. No foreigners entered, no Japanese could leave. Under the Tokugawa shogunate, peace reigned, but at the cost of progress. While Europe industrialized, Japan remained frozen in time. That peace was about to shatter. Then came the Black Ships. In 1853, Commodore Perry arrived from America. His warships filled Edo Bay with smoke and steel. To the Japanese, it felt like a monster from the future had landed. Perry came with a letter and a threat: open Japan or face war. Perry left, but vowed to return. Japan had 1 year to decide. In 1854, he came back with double the ships. The government had no choice. Japan signed the treaty. The gates to the outside world flew open, and with them came chaos, division, and the end of the samurai's monopoly on power. The samurai, once Japan's warriors and enforcers, began to lose their place. Guns replaced swords. Laws replaced honor. And Saigo Takamori, still young but rising, watched it all unfold. He saw clearly. Japan must change. But the cost: was the soul of the samurai worth sacrificing? Though a samurai, Saigo embraced reform. He helped broker secret alliances. In 1867, his forces pressured the shogun to step down. The emperor was restored to power. 1,000 years of samurai dominance ended with one quiet resignation. Saigo had won the war, but peace would break him. The Meiji Restoration had begun. Old Japan was dying. New Japan, modern, westernized, industrial, was rising fast. Railways replaced rickshaws. Uniforms replaced kimonos. But not everyone could keep up. Saigo, once the emperor's ally, watched the samurai vanish, and inside him, a quiet storm began to grow. Saigo joined the Meiji government. Briefly, they made him a general, but when talks began to train commoners in warfare, he resisted. The samurai were warriors. War was their birthright. To share that with farmers. To Saigo, it wasn't progress, it was betrayal. Then came Korea. They refused to recognize the Emperor of Japan. Saigo had a plan: go as envoy, act insulted, provoke his own death. So Japan would have a reason to wage war. He was willing to die to restore honor. The emperor agreed. The ministers did not. The plan was canceled. Humiliated and furious, Saigo resigned. He returned to Kagoshima, his home. But he didn't go alone. Thousands of loyal samurai followed him. They knew his heart, and they sensed it. This wasn't the end. It was a pause before a storm. Saigo opened a private school. It taught not just swordsmanship, but spirit, honor, discipline, loyalty. Within years, over 20,000 former samurai trained under him. But to the Meiji government, it looked like something else. A ticking time bomb, an army, a threat. Then, the match was struck. In 1877, government agents seized weapons from Kagoshima's arsenal. To Saigo's students, it was war. They attacked the depot, armed themselves, and rallied. They turned to Saigo and asked him to lead. He hesitated, but when he stood, history changed course. They marched under one banner, not to destroy Japan, but to save its soul. The Satsuma Rebellion had begun. Saigo led his men toward Tokyo, not for conquest, but to present the samurai's plea. They never made it. The imperial army blocked them, and the war began. The rebellion shocked Tokyo. Saigo, once the empire's hero, now led an army against it. But his goal wasn't power. It was dignity. The samurai had lost their rights. Now they would lose their lives. It was not a revolution. It was a funeral march. In armor, February 1877, Saigo reached Kumamoto. He sent messages to avoid bloodshed. No answer. The imperial army fired first. Many soldiers were just peasants with guns. But Saigo's men were samurai, disciplined, fierce. For weeks they surrounded the castle, but supplies ran out, and the tide began to turn. By May, Saigo was forced to retreat. The rebellion lost ground fast. The empire had railways. They had guns, and they had more men. The samurai ran low on bullets and food, but they kept marching. Their loyalty wasn't to win. It was to him. By September, the rebels made their final stand in Kagoshima. On Shiroyama Hill, just 500 samurai remained. They dug trenches, sharpened blades. They knew the end had come, but they would not surrender. Not with Saigo watching, not with history watching. September 24th, 1877. At dawn, the imperial army attacked. Artillery thundered. Smoke filled the mountain. The samurai returned fire until the bullets ran out. Then, they did what no rifleman could understand. They raised their swords and charged into history. Saigo was shot in the hip. He couldn't stand. So he followed tradition. He performed seppuku, ritual suicide. A friend beheaded him to preserve honor. It was the end. The last samurai had fallen, but his legend had just begun. The rebellion ended. 12,000 were dead. The samurai class was abolished. Those who survived became farmers or faded. But Saigo, he became a myth. His head was never found. Rumors spread that he still lived, waiting for Japan to need him again. Saigo Takamori didn't fight for glory. He fought for identity. He lived in a world changing too fast for tradition to survive. And instead of chasing power, he chose honor. That's why Japan calls him their last true hero, the samurai who defied modernity and died with dignity. In 1889, Japan did something unthinkable. They pardoned Saigo posthumously. And not just that, they built a statue, a man who rebelled against the emperor, now honored by the empire. Why? Because Saigo didn't die for power. He died for principle. Some call Saigo a hero. Others an enemy of progress. He helped modernize Japan, then fought against that very future. But that contradiction? It's exactly what makes him unforgettable. He didn't fear death. He feared losing who Japan was. The samurai lived by Bushido, a code of loyalty, sacrifice, and honor. But in the Meiji era, that code had no place. Saigo knew that. Still, he clung to it. Because if a nation loses its soul, no amount of railroads can save it. Saigo became the soul of old Japan, quiet, noble, bound to duty. He wasn't perfect, but he represented something people feared they were losing. To this day, his story is told, not just to remember the past, but to remind Japan what it once was. In 2003, Hollywood told his story, sort of. The Last Samurai used Saigo as inspiration, but changed names, added fiction, and turned him into a supporting character. Still, the world listened, and once again, Saigo Takamori walked across the screen. Today, Saigo's name echoes beyond Japan. He's studied by scholars, honored by martial artists, and admired by Stoics. Because no matter where you live, the struggle between tradition and change is universal. And so is the question, what would you die to protect? History isn't just facts, it's memory. And Saigo Takamori reminds us that strength is not in force, but in principle. That honor outlasts defeat. And sometimes the greatest legacy is knowing when to stand still while the world rushes ahead. Saigo's sword rests in a museum. His name rests in textbooks. But his spirit? It lives wherever someone chooses honor over ease, where someone stands, even alone. He was the last samurai, but not the last to believe. Saigo didn't belong in old Japan, or new Japan. He stood on a line that was vanishing beneath his feet. A samurai trained for a world that no longer existed, yet too noble for the politics of the new age. He was a man out of time. Progress has a price. In Japan, it cost the samurai their identity. Their swords were outlawed, their status revoked. But it wasn't just power they lost. It was purpose. And when a warrior loses purpose, he begins to fade. Honor isn't old-fashioned. It doesn't retire. And in Saigo's story, we see that it's not tied to time, but to truth. He never asked to be remembered. He only asked to be true, even if it killed him. Saigo never raised his sword against the emperor. He fought the men who surrounded him, the ministers, the modernizers. He believed the emperor had been misled, not corrupted. His loyalty was absolute. Even in rebellion, he remained faithful. Modern Japan was built by men like Saigo, even if they didn't survive it. Their sacrifice paved the way. Their silence taught restraint, and their courage still echoes in Japan's dignity today. Legends say Saigo's spirit still walks Shiroyama Hill, not haunting, but guarding, watching a Japan he gave everything for, not for victory, not for revenge, but to remind a modern world what honor once looked like. Was he a revolutionary, a traitor, a tragic idealist? Even now, historians argue about Saigo's motives, but maybe they missed the point. Saigo didn't care about labels. He cared about legacy. Legends grow with time, but Saigo's legend is built on fact, on blood, on loyalty, and on one final charge that still makes hearts stop. Because it wasn't just a battle, it was a message. Raised in Zen, Saigo believed that clarity came through suffering. He didn't chase comfort. He embraced stillness. And when Japan shook with change, he didn't panic. He listened. And then he chose. With Saigo's death, something deeper died too. Bushido was no longer law. Honor became optional. The sword became display. But for that final charge, it lived. One last time, in full. Saigo's life teaches this. Modernity moves fast, but character is slow. He never tried to stop progress. He just refused to be rushed into forgetting who he was. And sometimes, that's the most heroic thing a person can do. All over the world, people like Saigo appear. Leaders who love their homeland, but clash with its future. Their stories often end in defeat, but never in disgrace. Because some truths don't need victory to endure. After Saigo fell, Japan built fast. Factories, schools, armies. But beneath it all was the ghost of a man who warned them not to lose themselves. They ignored him at first, but in time, they built statues. Western leaders watched Japan closely, and Saigo's story fascinated them. A warrior standing against modernity? It seemed impossible. But to the West, he was more than a samurai. He was proof that tradition could still speak. In his time, many called him reckless, dangerous, too idealistic. But years later, even his critics visited his grave in silence, because whether they agreed or not, they knew what he gave, and that it cost everything. Saigo didn't rebel for power. He rebelled for meaning. He wanted Japan to modernize with soul, not just steel. He didn't fear guns or trains. He feared emptiness. He feared forgetting what it meant to be Japanese. From Saigo, we learn this. Don't resist change blindly, but don't follow it blindly either. Ask what's worth keeping. Ask what's worth fighting for. Even if you lose, you may still be right. Saigo didn't live to see the Japan he dreamed of, but parts of it exist. In its humility, its balance, its quiet strength, because of men like him, who lit candles, even when they knew the wind was coming. Saigo wasn't flawless. He made choices that cost lives. He clung to old ways too long, but perfection was never his goal, only honor, and in that, he was complete. In Japan, you bow for many reasons. Respect, regret, gratitude. Saigo bowed to no man, except the emperor. And even after death, Japan bows back every time his name is spoken. Saigo's story feels Japanese, but it's also human. Every culture has its Saigo, a person who stands for what's fading, who refuses to kneel to the future without bringing the past with him. And in that struggle, we see ourselves. Today we scroll, we swipe, we rarely bow. But maybe that's why Saigo matters more now. Because honor doesn't click, it doesn't trend, it commits. And in a world chasing everything, he chose one thing. He chose. Saigo didn't want to die. But he was willing. For a principle, for a people, for a way of life. And maybe the real question isn't how he died, but whether we'd stand for anything as fiercely as he did. In schools across Japan, children still hear Saigo's story, not because he won, but because he stood. His loyalty wasn't perfect, but it was pure. And that is a rare lesson in any age. Where he fell, there's now a garden. People walk, they pray, and they remember. Not just a man, but a spirit that refused to break. His name is carved in stone, but his meaning lives in motion. Legends get smoothed over, polished, safe. But Saigo wasn't safe. He challenged the very order he helped create. He reminds us, even noble men can cause chaos if they do nothing while the soul of a nation fades. Every generation needs its Saigo, a voice that doesn't bend, that chooses clarity over comfort. He may be gone, but his shape still fits inside our struggles. His silence still echoes. Every time we ask, who are we becoming? He wasn't just a swordsman, he was a farmer, a teacher, a philosopher, and when it mattered, a rebel. Not because he hated the empire, but because he loved it too much to watch it rot. They never found his head. Some say he escaped. Others say it was hidden to protect him. But maybe the truth is simpler. His story didn't need an ending. It needed a silence that people would keep trying to fill. This is the story of a man who bowed only once and never wavered. He died with nothing, but left Japan with something precious, a compass, and in the chaos of change. Sometimes that's the most valuable thing a man can leave behind. As a young man, Saigo drew his sword. As an old man, he laid it down. But his silence was louder than a war drum. He didn't need to shout. He only needed to stand still. And the world listened. Saigo wasn't just a man. He was a mirror. Every generation looks into him and sees what they fear losing most: loyalty, honor, identity. No one was like him because he dared to be unlike anyone. He didn't chase power. He carried his ideals like an ancient blade, worn but never broken. It wasn't just a weapon, it was belief, forged over time, unyielding. History often ends with victory, but Saigo's chapter ends with reverence, not because he won the war, but because he won over his own fear, and that made him unforgettable. Saigo died, but he never disappeared, because those who live with honor never truly leave. They echo in every generation that dares to live with purpose. He didn't write his story with ink. He wrote it with choices, with sacrifice, with blood. History needs no pen. When a man lives like a page, the world told him to stop. The government told him to step back, but his conscience told him to rise. Saigo listened to the voice inside. When Saigo fell, Japan rose. Not because he failed, but because he reminded them to rise with grace. You must kneel with purpose. Children still whisper it. Teachers still teach it. The elderly still remember it. The story of a man who didn't die for the past, but lived for what's right. One final moment. Saigo bowed his head, hand on his sword. The wind moved through grass, and history paused to breathe. Saigo didn't fight out of hate. He fought out of love. Love so deep, he had to defy what he once helped build. It wasn't easy, but he did it anyway. If Saigo walked into Tokyo today, no one might recognize him. But that feeling of guarding something sacred inside still exists in anyone who's ever lost something to loyalty. Trees grow from roots. Roots stay hidden. Saigo was a root. He didn't need spotlight. He nourished what came after, silently. Saigo knew there was no way back. Once you choose honor, you walk forward only, even if there's nothing ahead but cliffs. He didn't say win or die. He said live with truth, and if you must die, die standing. In Kagoshima, the fire still burns, not of war, but of memory. Each breeze on Shiroyama Hill whispers his name. Not everyone is born a samurai, but anyone can live like one. Brave, straight, loyal, willing to give up what's easy for what's right. Saigo left behind a question, not an answer. Between glory and honor, what would you choose? He bowed only once. To the emperor, but never to fear. It was a bow. That made him stand taller. The story of Saigo Takamori ended long ago, but his meaning never stopped. Because wherever honor still breathes, so does he. And his final message was never words. It was action.